I say this too because when I think about the future, it's hard for me to think of the future without being hyper present, which I think people are oftentimes have a lot of trouble with. We live in a world that's increasingly fatalistic, where we feel that we'll be figured out in an instant because of the giant walking data sets that we are.
Welcome to another episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series on the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory. The goal of our podcast series is to exchange ideas, bring awareness, and stay on top of the trends. My name is Samantha Sonnet, and I'm the social media and marketing coordinator for AMT Lab. Today, I'm joined by Dorothy Santos. We'll be talking about multidisciplinary arts and the intersection of art, technology, and culture. All right, so your work is very multidisciplinary. So my first question would be, can you please describe where your artistic interests meet? Maybe at the intersection of art, technology, and culture?
I feel a lot of people don't know this about me until they sit down and talk to me, such as what we're doing today. So thank you for having me. But I worked in biotech for about almost 14 years before I went back to go get a PhD. And the reason why the PhD was so instrumental in the way that I see myself as an artist is before that I did not see myself as an artist. I always felt that I was brought into projects. I need a writer, I need someone to kind of, process this thing through prose poetry or some kind of experimental prose, etc. And I did that for a few artists, but one in particular that stands out is Serbi Saraf, a New York-based artist who I adore and have been in constant communication with for years now. But that was probably the first time. I like pinpointing a moment because that is when I really felt that I could make things on my own, was in collaboration with her. But then also starting my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, or University of California, Santa Cruz, in film and digital media. And I'm doing a designated emphasis in computational media, and I usually say this when I give talks or I'm in conversation with people that don't know me, that usually the way that translates is if I write anything about film, it's usually focused on science fiction or horror. Those are my favorite film genres. And I usually fall more on the other side of the ampersand, so digital media, interactive fiction, speculative fictions, poetry, voice-based generative work, which is something I'm working on right now. And my dissertation and my academic research and my creative practice are all about voice technologies, speech generation, assistive tech. And so that's where the intersection is for me. But I also in the future want to continue the work I started in the program because originally I wanted to write my dissertation on DNA as media. So ancestry testing, race and genomics, DNA banking, because I worked in biotech for so long and I had seen the processes of how a clinical trial runs, et cetera, and all that kind of stuff fascinated me. But since I was a kid, I did all of the really kind of geeky, nerdy things. I had a rock collection, even though I was perceived and told repeatedly I didn't have the aptitude to do engineering or mathematics or anything of that nature. I still loved science, and I still do. But that's what I would say is kind of the nexus of it all.
That's awesome. I'm really interested specifically in your interactive fiction. So basically, it seems like your work asks audiences to make decisions as a story unfolds, for those who don't know what interactive fiction would be. So what are your thoughts on the current state of gamification and culture, and how does it play a role in art?
Well, for me, since I was a kid, games have always been art to me.
Yeah,
because
sure.
it takes an individual who wants to write the game, lead a person through a story or stories. I remember I really, really wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger, but I never had anyone to play with. I was the only child. So I grew up as the only child. And I think one of the moments that I really saw it hitting the mainstream, meaning gamification or interactive fiction, was Netflix came out with Bandersnatch.
Yes.
And I thought it was good. I remember I was on a trip I think I was going to a conference, and I was coming back, and then I was in the not in the airplane. I was in the car, and the Lyft driver was really friendly and, asked me what I was doing. I forgot where I was. And I said, oh, I'm here for a conference. And what kind of conference, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the thing that actually was the central focus of our conversation with me and this stranger. And he says, art, you're into art? Well, have you seen, and that's when he mentioned, he goes, have you seen Netflix, that Bandersnatch? You might like that. And I said, oh, I've seen that. And we started talking about it. And he said something really interesting. He said, that's the future. And in my head, I thought, okay, that's cool. Yes, I hear you. Yes, and. Because in my mind, that has always been my past, present, future, was games and the ways that people think of life in terms of options. I think that's why my favorite movie to date is Everything Everywhere All at Once. Yes. And I think also, as someone who's a queer Filipino person, there was so much in that film. And I don't want to get all emotional because I could already feel myself feeling emotional. Also because, I'm getting emotional. But seeing Michelle Yao and the actor who won, who I also grew up watching him on Indiana Jones.
Yes.
He's not age-wise, we're kind of close. Maybe he's a little older than me, but to kind of see the trajectory of art in that sense. So I grew up in that era of Back to the Future and Indiana Jones and all of these adventure kind of stories that were really epic. And so for me, that was kind of, I always made games for myself watching films like that. And I never thought that I could do that one day. And so do I think it's the future? I don't, that's always been a part of my life. So it's hard for me to say what I think of gamification when it's always been so intrinsic to how I think about the world. And, when people play games on their phones, there's a part of me that feels very Gen X when I say, yeah, but I played the board game version of that. What I mean? I played the analog version of that. You know what I mean? So, but again, to kind of go back really quickly, when I remember the first time, again, that I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I called it, my partner and I watched that movie, and I said, this reminds me of the Turn Down for What video, and then he, or they looked it up, my partner, and they're like, oh my gosh, you're right. It's the Daniels did this movie. And I said, to me, when I think about their filmmaking, because I am a film or media scholar, I mean, some people call me that. It's weird calling myself a media scholar, but here we go.
You are, for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But being someone in media,
yes,
I always am inspired by how people then incorporate that type of sensibility of the multiverse in their own work. And that was the first film in a long time that I've seen that really almost encapsulates so much of how I feel about my own practice. It's surreal, it's absurdist, it's weird, it's strange, but that's life.
Well, going off of that, do you think that anything in the future of tech creation, gamification scares you?
So Annie Liu, who's an artist, she did her work out of the MIT Media Lab. I've written about her work before, and she had this one piece. I mean, her whole oeuvre, her whole practice is something that's greatly impressed me. But she had this one piece where she kind of speculates, I think it's Kisses for the Future, where she said, oh, one day you'll go on a dating app or something, and then you could see someone's microbiome, and you could see their whole bio makeup and be like, okay, this person is susceptible to type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
And I remember seeing that work and thinking to myself, yo, I don't know if I want that.
Yeah, that's kind of terrifying.
I think I get it, in terms of biometrics and biosurveillance, and in terms of family and building kinship and, having meeting someone, falling in love, finding a partner. Of course, I get it. You want to know those things. But for your decision of who you want to be with, and that predicating your actions, that's just that's very neo-eugenicist. to me. I think if anything scares me, what scares me the most is anything related to the interiority of our bodies. And I think that's not just me, admittedly, and I have my own tensions and problematics around having worked in biotech, but I feel that that has always scared me because a lot of people, both science and technology it seems so magical or mystical to a lot of people, but it should not be like that. It shouldn't. And I think that's the reason why I really love the ethos or the kind of methodology of open source software, because it's this idea predicated on transparency and understanding and a dispersion of power. Shawe, Anna, and I always talk about this, that when you have power, your goal ought to be, in theory, at least for us, and it's hard. That's another thing, is you disperse power. You empower other people so that you're not diffusing conflict, or at least you kind of mitigate, but it's hard. It's hard work to be transparent. It's hard work to teach other people. It takes patience, but that's what it takes. You have to engage in that. And I do actually want to return to biotechnology through my work with Lee Blaylock and Heather Dewey Hagborg, who are longtime friends and collaborators. But I think that's something that frightens me. And I know for both Lee and for Heather, that's something that's of concern to them. And Heather's work that's how we met. I wrote about Heather's work. And Stranger Visions, a project that she did when she was a fellow and artist resident at I-Beam years ago. So that's the thing that probably scares me most.
Okay. Well, this is a slight tangent, but I think it's still relevant to what we were just talking about with ethics and everything. So I think moving slightly away from what we were just talking about, do you have any ethical thoughts about interventions concerning AI-generated art, music, literature, whatever it may be?
I've been thinking a lot about this through the lens of voice, though, because I think right now people's concern is mostly with image and moving image. So people who are familiar with like runway, ML, generative filmmaking or deep fakes is probably my big concern, because it includes voice and a lot of image generation. So I get people's kind of concerns around that. And, the strange thing around the word ethics and ethos, and, Shawe and I have talked extensively about this, and Hana as well. You could tell they make their way into my creative practice all the time, because, those are two really close collaborators. But one of the things we've discussed in the past is there a thing such as ethics? Because especially if you're talking about artificial intelligence, you are already setting the AI to look for or execute a particular code, and you are wanting it to perform a type of scraping of data or looking for certain things in particular. So it's always strange to think about ethics when something is already biased.
Yeah, for sure.
Intentionally. And it runs the gamut. I think for me in regard to voice in particular, I think the issues that I have mostly to do with accent bias, and the implicit bias that comes with that. Within my own academic research, I mentioned that I'm doing voice technology or voice recognition, speech technologies. I'm also looking at assistive text. So, I've read everything as much as I can. Not everything, I should take that back. As much as I can on like Amazon Alexa and Siri and different types of voice cloning platforms and technologies, because there's so many out there now. But the reason why accent reduction and accent elimination is of concern to me is because, I'm also critiquing companies such as Sonnet AI. They're not going to hire me anytime soon, which is fine by me. But that's a platform I wish didn't exist. And I'm pretty sure that the founders of that company would never want to talk to me, because they would think, well, instantaneously, you don't even know what we're trying to do. And I said, well, the fact of the matter is, you have branding and marketing on your website where you have this racially ambiguous face, but you only see the mouth, and then you have the words in bold sans serif font, hear the magic. Again, this idea of creating something mystical and magical so that the it outwardly seems like something magical is happening, which I don't like. That's a misuse of this concept of magic. But to have an audible, discernible Indian voice speaking, and then, toggling, this kind of text on the lower right-hand corner where it says, without sinus, with sinus. And then you toggle the slider, and then all of a sudden the voice is transformed to an American standard accent. Okay. So to me, yes, there's many ways to answer that question, but in terms of my focus, I think I can narrow it down to that, just because I've been thinking about that so much and what it does when we flatten the voice, or we flatten it to, the lingua franca of American and British Englishes. And so I think a lot of people might say, well, you have an American accent. Who are you to say? But I grew up in an immigrant Filipino family. I witnessed my mom suppressing her own accent because she was so intimidated or scared to sound, unintelligent. And that's not what makes someone intelligent. No. I'm sorry, but it's not. I think even for me, I feel very comfortable with you two, like sitting here having a conversation. So this is one particular voice that I have, and I understand that. I've been told too, you sound very different when you're talking to different people. And I'm like, yeah, because I'm probably not going to talk to I'm not going to talk to, in a professional meeting, I'm not going to talk a certain way, but I think that that's kind of the beauty, but also the problematics of having grown up in a very kind of multicultural, multilingual household and community. I was born and raised in San Francisco, California, in the Mission District. And what was interesting, and this kind of relates to the question of ethics here too, is I grew up with parents that cognitively, they believed that I would be confused if they taught me Tagalog. So what they did was, they spoke to me in Tagalog. I answered in English. So I know technically how to read, write, poorly, not well. And I know how to translate Tagalog. So if I listen to my aunties and my uncles or my relatives, my cousins, I can actually translate in real time Tagalog. But when I speak it, it sounds like an American speaking Tagalog. So, but the language, the irony is that I learned Spanish before I even learned Tagalog. And so a lot of that had to do with our neighbor who helped look after me, Mama Miriam, who's still in the same apartment. Mm-hmm. And she didn't speak English. She spoke Spanish. So it's a very Bay Area. It's a very kind of specific experience of having grown up in the Bay, concurrently speaking English and Spanish, but I spoke those two languages fluently with the Tagalog accent when I was a kid.
It's part of your identity as well.
And it's part of my identity as well.
Absolutely.
And so when I think about the ethics of my own experience and how that informs the types of softwares I want to critique and or build with other people, it's taking into account that I don't want the voice to be colonized either. And I think people don't think of colonization as, they think of it, yes, land, physical objects, tangible things. But also one of the things that I've explored in my own research is that voice is one of those kind of immaterial, quote unquote, kind of, and I'm using this language very specifically, it's like a frontier for a lot of people. And I don't like that. It's very imperialist language, very colonialist, but, there's a voice activated architecture. You could even use, there's automobile industries that are, racing, no pun intended. They've used that language too, that are trying to get voice activated features in cars now. So voice is a thing that I've grown very passionate about over the past few years, especially.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Tech in the Arts. Be on the lookout for our Part 2 episode coming to you very soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send this to another arts or technology aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you think of this podcast by visiting our website, amptlab.org, or you can email us at amptlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts or Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.